The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was one of the most beautiful places in the known galaxy. The walls were carved from a stone that only existed on Ethon Prime, a pale silver rock that caught light and scattered it like broken glass across the floor. The ceiling stretched so high that the top of it was lost in soft shadow. 12 curved seats lined the upper ring of the chamber, each one shaped for a different kind of body: crystalline pillars, containment spheres, liquid tanks, cushioned platforms. Every seat held a representative of a different species, and together they called themselves the voice of all civilized life. In the center of the chamber, on a single flat platform that was designed to make whoever stood on it feel very small, stood a man named Junho. He was not a tall man. He had a calm face and dark eyes that moved slowly, taking in everything without rushing. He wore the deep blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, pressed clean, with no medals or decorations on it. He believed that decorations were for people who needed others to know how important they were. Junho never needed that. He had been standing on that platform for 2 hours. The charges had started small. Humanity had missed 3 filing deadlines for the Harmony Accord's annual review. Humanity had sent armed escort vessels into a trade corridor where weapons were prohibited. Humanity had, during a cultural exchange summit, allowed one of its officers to raise his voice at a Torathi delegate. Then the charges grew larger. Humanity had not reduced the size of its military as required by the full membership agreement. Humanity had continued building warships in its outer territories. Humanity had declined to submit its defense research to the Council's shared knowledge archive. Veloreth, the Council chairman, read each charge in a flat, even voice. He was tall and made of something that looked like pale crystal, and his face did not move when he spoke. His kind, the Vethari, had not felt emotion in the way most species understood it for over 3,000 years. They had reasoned their feelings away, slowly, one generation at a time, until all that was left was logic. Veloreth considered this an achievement. Kraz, the Torathi delegate, was far less quiet about it. The Torathi were insectoid, with 6 limbs and compound eyes that reflected the chamber's light in hundreds of tiny pieces. Kraz had been pushing for this hearing for 2 years. He clicked his mouthparts together each time Veloreth finished reading a charge, a habit that those who knew him recognized as satisfaction. Junho listened to all of it without moving. His aide, Murray, stood 2 steps behind him. She was younger than him by 15 years, with sharp eyes and a way of holding her jaw that meant she was working very hard not to say something. She had already written 7 responses in her head, each one better than the last, and she had given none of them voice because Junho had told her, on the transport ride to Ethon Prime, that today was not a day for responses. When Veloreth finished reading the last charge, the chamber was quiet. Kraz leaned forward. "The motion," he said in the shared galactic tongue, "is that humanity's membership be suspended, indefinitely, until such time as the species demonstrates the willingness to reform its cultural tendencies toward aggression, conflict, and unilateral action. They are not ready for this council. They have never been ready. We made an error in admitting them, and this is the correction of that error." Junho was given 2 minutes to speak. He stepped forward to the small raised section of the platform that meant he was addressing the full chamber. He looked up at the 12 seats. He took 1 slow breath. "I hear the charges," he said. His voice was quiet enough that the chamber's acoustics had to carry it. "I understand the frustration behind them. Humanity is difficult. We argue, we build weapons, we raise our voices when we feel something is wrong. We do not always fit neatly into the forms you ask us to fill out." He paused. "But I want to ask the Council one question before the vote is called. Not a challenge, a genuine question." He looked at Veloreth directly. "When the galaxy last faced something it could not negotiate with, which species answered first?" Nobody spoke. "When the Durrani plague spread through 4 systems and the containment protocols failed, which medical team stayed until the last patient was stable?" He waited. "When the Luvani homeworld's orbit began to shift, and the council's calculations said relocation was the only answer, which engineers worked for 8 months without rest to find a different solution. He let the silence sit. "We are difficult," he said again, "because we care too much to be easy." Veloreth called the vote. Only one voice spoke against the motion. Orin, oldest member of the council, a being of slow gas and long memory contained in a large sphere of reinforced glass, spoke in a voice like wind moving through tall grass. "You are not removing a problem," Orin said. "You are removing the only species in this galaxy that has ever bled to solve one. I have lived long enough to know the difference between a threat and a shield. You are choosing to throw the shield away." The sphere pulsed once with dim light. "Remember this moment. You will be asked to eventually." The vote was 11-1. Junho heard the result. He stood still for 3 full seconds, and then he did something that caused more discomfort in that chamber than any argument or protest could have managed. He smiled. It was not a mean smile. It was not a bitter smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed something he had not expected and had decided it might be useful. Several of the delegates shifted in their seats without knowing why. Murray stepped up beside him. "Should I begin the withdrawal protocols, Ambassador?" "Yes," he said. He turned from the platform and began walking toward the chamber doors at a steady, unhurried pace. "And Murray, make sure they see us leave." They left. Not just Junho and Murray. Every human in the building walked out. Staff, assistants, cultural liaison officers, the kitchen workers in the delegate dining hall, the 2 maintenance engineers who had been repairing a ventilation unit on the 3rd floor. All of them received the same silent signal on their personal communicators, and all of them stopped what they were doing, collected their belongings if they had any within reach, and walked to the nearest exit. They did not rush. They did not shout. They walked with the kind of calm that comes from having already decided something a long time ago and simply waiting for the moment to act on it. On the external docking rings of Ethon Prime, human vessels began to disengage. Not 1 or 2, all of them. The Council's traffic systems had never seen a coordinated withdrawal at this scale. Dozens of ships, then hundreds, pulling back from docking clamps, rotating away from the station's arms, and forming a long, quiet line that moved toward open space. In the grand chamber, Veloreth watched the display feed in silence. The ships moved as if they had been practicing this for years. Perhaps they had. The last human vessel cleared the council boundary marker, and then the feed showed only empty space. Kraz announced that the matter was resolved. He said the galaxy would be more peaceful for it. Veloreth said nothing. He looked at the empty space on the feed for a moment longer than he intended, then closed the display. In his containment sphere, Orin did not move. He did not speak. His light, which had been warm and steady for decades, dimmed slowly, the way an old fire does when the wood beneath it turns to ash. Nobody in the chamber noticed, or if they did, they decided not to mention it. Outside, in the dark between stars, the last of the human ships disappeared. They did not look back. 7 years passed. For the Galactic Council, those 7 years were, by every measurable standard, a success. Trade agreements were signed between species that had been in quiet disputes for decades. 3 new members were admitted, all of them calm, cooperative, and perfectly willing to file their paperwork on time. The Harmony Accords were updated, expanded, and translated into 41 languages. Veloreth gave a long speech at the 5-year summit about the new age of galactic cooperation, and it was received with great enthusiasm. He gave a shorter version of the same speech at the 6-year summit, and it was received with slightly less enthusiasm but still considered a success. Nobody talked about humanity very much. In the early months after the withdrawal, there had been some discussion. Kraz gave several public statements about the wisdom of the decision. A few council researchers filed reports on what they called the human absence effect, which mostly concluded that nothing had changed and that the absence proved the original argument correct. Eventually, even those reports stopped. Humanity was simply not there. Their space, a wide band of the outer spiral arm that the Council had always considered underdeveloped and not particularly interesting, went quiet. Human ships still moved inside human territory. Occasionally one was spotted near the boundary, but it never crossed. No hails were answered. No invitations to summits were accepted. When Council diplomatic vessels tried to make contact, the responses were polite, brief, and completely uninformative. The prevailing theory, which Kraz stated confidently at every opportunity, was that humanity was struggling. Cut off from Council trade, Council technology sharing, and Council resources, they were surely pulling inward, dealing with internal problems, maybe even declining. Isolation will show them what they truly are, Kraz said in one recorded address. A species that cannot thrive without the structure we provided. Oren, when shown a transcript of this speech, said only, "He has never met a human." Then he went quiet again and did not volunteer further opinion. The truth of what was happening inside human space was something the Council did not know, because they were not looking carefully enough. And because humans, when left alone with a problem, do not make noise about it. They get to work. So he had not slept more than 5 hours a night in 3 years, and she considered this reasonable given the circumstances. She ran the Human Isolation Research Division from a facility on one of humanity's outer stations, a place with no name, only a number, because they had stopped giving names to places when resources got tight and they needed to move faster. Her team of 240 researchers had started as a technology gap analysis group. Their original job was to figure out what human science would lose by being cut off from the Council's shared archives, and to plan around it. They had quickly discovered something interesting. The Council's shared archives were enormous and impressive, and contained thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. They were also organized around the assumption that all problems had already been framed correctly. Every research path in the archive started from a foundation that earlier species had laid down. It was brilliant, but it was also a kind of cage. You could go very far inside it, but you could not go outside it. Humans, forced out of the archive, had started from their own foundations. Some of those foundations were rougher, some were slower, but some were pointed in directions that the Council archive had never mapped, because no one inside the Council had ever needed to look that way before. By the 4th year of isolation, Sohi's division had produced 17 new research branches that did not exist anywhere in the Council's knowledge base. She did not celebrate this. She wrote it down and moved on to the next problem. In the Frontier Fleet, Admiral Teal had done something that would have been impossible under the Harmony Accords. He had rebuilt the entire command structure from the bottom up. Under Council rules, human warships were limited in size, limited in weapon type, and required to carry a Council observer on every vessel above a certain tonnage. Without those rules, Teal had spent 7 years designing ships the way humans actually needed them, not the way the Council decided they should be. The new ships were not elegant. They were not the smooth, carefully proportioned vessels that Council members admired at diplomatic showings. They were built for work. They were built for long operations far from resupply. They were built with the understanding that the person flying them might need to make decisions very quickly, without waiting for a chain of approval to run its course. Teal had trained his crews with that same understanding. He did not talk about what the fleet was for. If anyone asked, he said he was preparing for all possibilities. When people pressed him, he said he hoped none of the possibilities would be necessary. When people pressed him a 3rd time, he gave them a look that made them stop pressing. Junho's memoir came out in the 3rd year. He had retired from active diplomacy at the end of year 1, moved to a quiet part of human space, and written the whole thing in 18 months. It was not a dramatic book. It was careful and honest and sometimes quite funny, in the dry way that Junho was funny, which was the way that made people laugh and then think about something uncomfortable. It became the most widely read book in human space, not because it was about the council, but because it was about what happened when you decided to stop asking someone else to define your worth. The last line of the book was passed around in messages and scratched onto walls in a few places, the way lines become part of a people when the people need them. They gave us back our freedom and called it punishment. I have never been more grateful for an insult. Woo-jin read that line on the first day of his military training, when he was 22 years old and nervous, and trying not to show it. He wrote it on the inside cover of his training manual, not because he was sentimental, but because he found it useful. He was part of the first full generation of soldiers trained entirely without the Harmony Accords restrictions, without council observers, without the long list of things that were not permitted. His instructors did not teach him how to fight within a set of approved rules. They taught him how to think, how to change direction in the middle of a plan when the plan stopped working, how to use what was available rather than waiting for what was ideal. He graduated near the top of his class and was assigned to a fast response unit in the outer fleet. He spent his first deployment patrolling a quiet stretch of boundary space and found it boring, which his commander told him was a good sign. He did not know yet what the next deployment would bring. None of them did. In the council, at the 7-year summit, Veloreth gave another speech. It was well organized and carefully worded, and said essentially the same things the previous speeches had said. The delegates applauded in the ways their respective biologies allowed. Another year of harmony was declared. Outside the chamber, in the corridor after the session ended, a junior Luveni aide stopped Ismara, the Luveni delegate, and asked her what she was thinking. Ismara had been standing at the corridor window, looking out at the stars. She was bioluminescent, and her glow, which was usually a warm amber, had been a pale and thoughtful blue all evening. "I am thinking," Ismara said quietly, "that silence from that direction has lasted too long to mean what Kraz thinks it means." She looked at the stars a moment longer. When something quiet has been working very hard for 7 years, the quiet does not mean it has stopped. It means it is almost ready. She turned from the window and walked away. The stars did not answer her. Somewhere in the dark of the outer spiral arm, they did not need to. It started with a ship that stopped talking. The Torathi Deep Survey vessel was a standard long-range model, crewed by 40 and equipped with the best sensor array that Council technology had to offer. It had been mapping the far edge of Torathi space, a routine operation that had been running on a regular rotation for 60 years without incident. Its last transmission was a standard check-in log, nothing unusual, no alerts, no distress markers. Then it was quiet. The Torathi Fleet Command sent a follow-up ping. No answer. They sent 3 more, spread over 4 days. Nothing. A search vessel was dispatched. It reached the last known coordinates of the survey ship and found nothing. Not wreckage, not debris, not even the faint chemical signature that a ship leaves behind when something goes wrong. Just empty space with a quality of emptiness that the search vessel's captain later described in her report as wrong, in a way I do not have better words for. 2 weeks after the survey vessel went silent, a Torathi mining colony on a moon at the system's edge stopped responding. 43,000 people. Gone between one transmission and the next, with no warning, no distress call, no evidence left behind except the faint, cold shells of buildings that looked, according to the investigative team, as if they had been very carefully emptied. The Council received the report and classified it as a Priority 2 investigation, which meant they were concerned but not yet alarmed. Veloreth assembled a committee. The committee met 4 times over 2 months and produced a report that listed 17 possible explanations, ranging from equipment failure to a localized atmospheric event, and recommended further study. While the committee was meeting, a Torathi defense fleet of 300 ships was sent to the region to establish a presence and investigate in force. It entered the area of concern. It sent back 3 days of routine reports. Then it also went quiet. The committee met again, urgently, and the priority 2 was raised to priority 1. Kraz, whose species had just lost 300 ships, was no longer making confident public statements. The thing that had taken the ships and the colony and the survey vessel was not new to the galaxy. It was, in a terrible way, older than the galaxy as anyone in the Council had ever known it. The Vreth had existed before the first Council member species had evolved past simple tools. They were part machine and part organic, an ancient civilization that had not expanded or explored or made contact for so long that most Council archives listed them as extinct. A few very old records, translated from languages that only Orin still fully understood, described them not as a civilization at all but as a process, something like weather, something that moved through space and consumed what it found and moved on, neither cruel nor kind, simply hungry in the way that ancient things are hungry, without reason and without end. They had been sleeping, deep in a region of space that nobody had visited because there was nothing there worth visiting. The Vreth had been dormant in a way that their ancient records called a long rest. What had woken them was not fully clear. Some of the Council's researchers theorized it was a specific type of energy signature that had changed since the realignment of Council shipping lanes after humanity's withdrawal. Others thought it was simply time. Things that sleep eventually wake. They did not send messages. They did not respond to signals. They did not appear on sensors until they were already close, because they did not produce the kinds of energy that Council sensor arrays had been calibrated to detect. By the time a Council world or station or fleet knew the Vreth were near, it was generally too late to do anything meaningful about it. Within 6 months of the first missing survey ship, they had consumed 4 Torathi colony systems and disabled or destroyed 2 full Council defense fleets. The Torathi military, the largest and most aggressive in the Council, had been built over centuries to fight other species, to understand the logic of an enemy, to read intent and respond with force. The Vreth had no intent. They had no logic that translated. Fighting them was like trying to have an argument with a flood. Veloreth called an emergency session. The Grand Chamber was full in a way it rarely was. Every species had sent their senior delegate and several had sent additional representatives. The chamber smelled of many different biologies all feeling the same thing, which was fear wearing the mask of concern. Veloreth stood at the central podium and presented the data. He was precise and organized and thorough. He took no pleasure in the moment. To his credit, he did not minimize the numbers. He read them plainly. Current Vreth advance rate. Projected expansion. Time to Council core systems at present speed, assuming no effective resistance. The tactical AI had run the calculation 17 times and produced the same result each time, because mathematics does not change when you ask it nicely. 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. The chamber was silent in the way that very large rooms are silent, when every being inside has stopped breathing at the same moment. The discussion that followed lasted 9 hours. Every strategy was presented. The Dulani proposed a barrier network of energy stations. The Luvani proposed an attempt at communication. The remaining Torathi delegates proposed a combined military strike at the Vreth advance edge. Each proposal was analyzed, costed, and found to be inadequate by margins that were not small. The Council had spent 7 years building a structure of peace. It was a genuinely fine structure. It had no load-bearing walls. Near the end of the 9th hour, when the proposals had run out, and the chamber had settled into the particular heavy quiet that comes after all the obvious answers have been tried and failed, Orin spoke. Orin had been present the entire time. The old being's containment sphere sat in its high seat, unchanged in appearance from the day Orin had voted against humanity's suspension. Unchanged, except that the light inside was very low, as it had been for months. "There is a species," Orin said, in a voice that the chamber had to be quiet to hear, "that has been fighting extinction-level threats for the entirety of its short and extraordinary history, not because it wanted to, because it had no other option and it adapted rather than collapsed. The sphere pulsed softly. A species that treats a problem that cannot be solved as a personal insult and works on it until it finds a way, even if finding the way costs it greatly. Nobody spoke. They were not removed because they were a threat, Oren said. They were removed because they were uncomfortable to be around, because they reminded everyone in this room that peace is not the natural state of the universe. A pause. The natural state of the universe is indifferent. Humanity is the only species that takes that personally. The light in the sphere dimmed further. You know where they are. Their space has been quiet. I suspect that the quiet has been doing exactly what quiet does when the people keeping it are human. The ancient voice was steady and without judgment. It was simply tired. The question you need to answer before this session ends is not how to fight the Vreth. You have seen the numbers. You know you cannot do it alone. Another long pause. The question is whether your pride will be the thing that outlasts your civilization. Veloreth looked at the sphere for a moment. Then he looked away. The session ended without a resolution. But in the hallway outside, where Esmara of the Luveni stood watching the other delegates file past with the dull, heavy movements of people who had run out of ideas, she sent a private message to her aide. It contained 3 words and a set of coordinates. The coordinates were in human space. The 3 words were, find a way. Deciding to make the call was easy. Deciding who would make it took 6 days. Nobody on the council wanted to be the one. It was not cowardice exactly, though it looked like cowardice from the outside. It was something more complicated, the kind of reluctance that comes from knowing that asking for help means admitting you were wrong, and that the people you were wrong about are now in a position to say so. Veloreth privately reviewed the options for 3 days before assigning the task to Esmara. Esmara of the Luveni accepted without complaint. Her species were diplomats by nature, soft-spoken and warm, with a bioluminescence that made them appear to glow with gentle light in dim rooms. She had been the one pushing quietly for the contact attempt since the emergency session. She had expected to be given this responsibility, and she had been thinking about what to say for most of those 6 days. She did not write a speech. She sat down at a recording terminal in her private chamber, turned on the transmission log, and spoke the way she would speak to someone she had made a mistake with and knew it. She said that the council had taken a vote 7 years ago that she had not agreed with at the time and had been less certain of with every year that passed since. She said that something ancient and dangerous had woken up in the galaxy, and that the council had run its numbers and its options, and found that it was not equipped to face what was coming on its own. She said she understood that humanity owed the council nothing, and that asking for help when you had treated someone badly was the kind of thing that deserved to be refused. Then she said something that no council communication to humanity had ever contained before. She said she was sorry, not on behalf of the process, not as a diplomatic formality. She said it plainly, the way people say it when they mean it and are not sure if it will be accepted, which is the only way it counts. She sent the message and sat in the quiet of her chamber and waited. The message traveled across the boundary, through the dark and into human space. It was received by Murray. She was not the senior diplomat anymore, not officially. She held the title of Director of Outer Relations now, which was a bigger job with a longer name but was still at its core. The work of watching what the rest of the galaxy was doing and thinking about what it meant for humanity. She had been watching the Vreth situation reports with the focused calm of someone who had been expecting something like this, not the Vreth specifically, but something. A reason. She had filed 3 internal reports in the past year suggesting humanity should begin preparing a position on possible re-engagement with the Council. All 3 had been acknowledged and set aside. She read Esmara's message twice. Then she walked to the window of her office and looked out at the stars for a while. When she turned back, she called 5 people. Sohi, because she needed to know what they could actually offer. Teal, because whatever happened, the fleet would be part of it. 2 senior members of the Human Policy Council, because the decision was not hers alone, and one retired ambassador whose opinion she trusted more than anyone else in human space, even though he had been growing vegetables on a quiet station for 4 years and claimed to have stopped thinking about galactic politics. Junho answered the call on the second ring. He was wearing old clothes and had soil on his hands. He listened to Murray explain the situation without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Read me the last paragraph of her message again," he said. Murray read it. Junho nodded slowly. "She means it," he said. "I've received a lot of diplomatic apologies. That one is real." He wiped his hands on a cloth hanging from his belt. "Call the meeting." The meeting was nothing like a council session. It was 5 people around a table in a room with no ceremony, no elevated platforms, no architectural statements about who held authority. Someone brought food. Someone brought too much coffee. The discussion was loud for the first hour, with Teal and one of the policy council members going back and forth so forcefully that Zoe had to raise her voice to be heard over them, which she did not enjoy but was willing to do. The question was not whether to help. Humanity's nature had settled that before anyone sat down. The question was on what terms and what shape the help would take, and what it would mean for human space going forward. Murray listened to all of it. She took notes. She asked questions when things got too abstract and pulled the conversation back to the practical when it drifted. At the end of 2 hours, when the argument had run through most of its energy, she looked at her notes and said, "Here is what I think we are all actually agreeing on." She laid it out. Humanity would respond, but not as a subordinate coming back to ask forgiveness. As a partner, offering something that the council needed, and that the council would acknowledge it needed, in writing, formally, in the permanent record. Human military command authority over joint operations in the field, because the people best equipped to run an unconventional war were going to run it their way or not at all. And a formal apology from the council, not a private one from a single delegate but a real one, entered into the official record where every species could read it. Teal said, "They'll push back on the command authority clause." "I know," Murray said. "And the formal apology in the record. Veloreth won't like it." "I know. So what do we do if they say no?" Murray picked up her pen. "Then we say no," she said, "and we go back to our side of the border." She looked at him. "But they won't say no, because if they could solve this without us, we would not be having this conversation." The vote was unanimous. Murray wrote the response herself. It was 3 pages, which was long for a diplomatic reply, and it was written in plain language that did not leave room for creative interpretation. She sent it to Asmara with a note that said only, "Take this to Veloreth personally. Don't let anyone summarize it for him." On Ethon Prime, Veloreth read all 3 pages without stopping. He set the document down. He picked it up and read the command authority clause again. He set it down again. Kraz, when shown a copy, began a loud and detailed objection that lasted nearly 20 minutes. Orin waited for it to end and then said in the simplest possible terms, "Sign it." Kraz turned to argue. Orin's sphere brightened very slightly and Kraz stopped. Veloreth signed it. The formal apology was drafted, approved, and entered into the permanent council record the following morning. Veloreth did not make a speech about it. He signed the document and moved to the next item on the agenda with the efficiency of someone choosing not to linger on something uncomfortable. 3 days later, the first human fleet crossed the boundary back into council space. Teal stood on the bridge of the flagship and watched Ethon Prime grow on the forward screen. Behind him, in a long, quiet line that stretched back further than the screen could show, the rest of the fleet followed. The ships were not what the council remembered. They were larger in some places, denser in others, with angles and configurations that did not come from any design philosophy the council's engineers would recognize. They looked like ships built by people who had stopped waiting for permission. On the lower deck of the flagship, Wujin stood at a viewport with 2 other soldiers, looking out at the alien station. He had seen pictures of Ethan Prime in training files. It was smaller in reality than it looked in the images, or maybe it was just that the fleet around him was larger than he had fully understood until this moment. One of the other soldiers said, "You think they're watching us right now?" Wujin looked at the station. "Yes," he said. "Weird feeling." "Yes," he said again. Teal's voice came over the fleet channel. It was steady and short, the way Teal always spoke when he was saying something that mattered. "We didn't come back because they welcomed us. We came back because someone needed to do the work." A pause. "Let's go do it." The fleet moved forward. The work was waiting. The first joint briefing between human commanders and Council military delegates lasted 4 hours and was, by every account, deeply uncomfortable for the Council side of the table. Not because the humans were rude. They were not. They were focused, prepared, and moved through the tactical data with a speed and confidence that left several of the Council officers struggling to keep pace. The discomfort came from something harder to name. The human commanders did not treat the Vreth as an overwhelming force requiring careful, managed response. They treated it as a solvable problem that they had not yet solved, which was a different thing entirely, and the difference sat in the room like a change in air pressure. Teal laid out the operational picture in plain terms. The Vreth advanced along predictable consumption paths, but their detection signature was too low for standard Council sensors to catch early enough to matter. Their outer shell structure was resistant to every directed energy weapon in the current joint arsenal. Their coordination was not based on any communication signal the Council had found, which meant jamming and signal disruption had no effect. Every strategy the Council had attempted so far had been built on the assumption that the Vreth operated like a military force, with a structure that could be disrupted and a command center that could be targeted. "They don't have a command center," Teal said. "They have a process. You can't cut the head off something that doesn't have a head." He looked at the assembled delegates. "So we change the question. Instead of how do we destroy the process, we ask how do we disrupt it? How do we make the environment they move through hostile to them at a level they cannot adapt around?" The Council's senior tactical officer, a Dulani of considerable experience, said carefully, "That approach requires a weapons platform that does not currently exist." Teal looked at Sohi, who was sitting at the far end of the table with a data slate in her hands and an expression of mild impatience. The way a person looks when they have been waiting to say something, and have been waiting longer than they would have preferred. "It exists," she said. "We built it." She set the data slate on the table. 7 years ago, when we lost access to the Council's shared archive, we had to rebuild several research branches from different foundations. One of those branches went in a direction nobody in this archive had mapped. She paused. "It turns out that when you are not limited by the assumptions of the last 3,000 years of established science, some very interesting doors open." She walked them through it without drama. A resonance-based disruption system that targeted the biological component of the Vreth's machine-organic integration. The Council's researchers had never found a weakness in the Vreth's outer structure because they had been looking at the machine parts. The biological parts were older, less modified, and carried a specific resonance frequency that, when matched and amplified, caused a catastrophic breakdown in the integration system. In simple terms, it made the machine and the organic parts stop working together. The Council's lead scientist, a Luveni researcher who had spent 20 years studying the Vreth's physical structure without finding an entry point, looked at the data on Sohi's slate for a long time without speaking. "How long have you had this?" she finally asked. "Functional model," Sohi said. 14 months. Weapons applicable version, 6 months. We wanted to be sure it worked at scale before we made it relevant." The Luveni researcher looked at the data again. "We were looking at the wrong layer," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "You were looking where your archive told you to look," Sohi said, not unkindly. "It's a good archive, it just didn't have everything." The deployment plan took 3 weeks to finalize. The disruption array needed to be delivered to the heart of the Vreth advance, close enough to affect the largest concentration of their force, which meant getting a team through the outer edge of the advance where the consumption activity was heaviest. The projected survival rate for the delivery team was 34%. This number was presented in the briefing with the careful, neutral tone of someone who understands that the people hearing it are about to be asked to volunteer anyway. Woojin was part of the delivery team. He had not volunteered for romantic reasons or because he was reckless. He had volunteered because his unit had the fastest response time of any small team in the fleet, and because his training had been built specifically for the kind of high-variable, low-certainty operation that this was. His commander had approved the assignment without excessive discussion because the 34% was a number, and numbers did not change what needed doing. The mission moved in stages. The outer approach went faster than projected because Teal's fleet provided a pattern of coordinated pressure on the Vreth's flanks that drew their attention away from the inner corridor. It was not a distraction in the theatrical sense. It was a calculated use of movement and energy signatures to shift where the Vreth process was directing its activity, the way you divert a river not by blocking it, but by giving it somewhere else to go. Several council observers on the fleet bridge watched Teal manage this in real time and said very little but remembered everything. Woojin's team reached the deployment coordinates 20 minutes ahead of schedule. The space around them looked nothing like what any of them had trained for in simulations, because no simulation had ever seen Vreth activity from inside the advance. It was dark in the way that space is always dark, but there was something in it, a quality of presence that did not resolve on any sensor, but that every member of the team felt in the same place in their chest. One of the soldiers said nothing, but reached up and touched a small item on a chain around her neck. Nobody remarked on this. The array deployed. Sohi's system activated. For 11 seconds nothing happened, and those 11 seconds were the longest of Woojin's life. Then the advance edge of the Vreth force began to stop. Not dramatically, not with the kind of explosion or collapse that battle footage usually showed in training files. It was quieter than that. The Vreth units at the closest range began to lose coherence, the machine parts and the organic parts drifting apart from each other in slow, silent separation, like ice releasing from rock when the temperature changes. It spread outward from the deployment point in a wave. Slow at first, then faster, moving through the advance along whatever invisible network connected the Vreth process to itself. The team got out. Not everyone. 2 of the 12 did not make it back to the extraction point. Woojin did not look away from that fact or try to make it mean something cleaner than it was. He carried it forward with him, which was the only honest thing to do with it. Over the following 6 weeks, the Vreth advance collapsed. It did not collapse all at once. It retreated, and then sections of it destabilized, and then the outer edges lost cohesion entirely, and then the core of the advance, the oldest and most deeply integrated part, began to go quiet. The Council's researchers, working alongside Sohi's team with the kind of focused collaboration that happens when people stop worrying about who gets credit, refined the disruption system as they went. Each iteration worked better than the last. Each setback produced a new data point that the next design accounted for. 6 weeks. The thing that had calculated 4 years and 2 months of inevitable destruction was gone. The Grand Chamber on Ethon Prime was quieter than it had been during any session in recent memory when Murray walked in. Not a fearful quiet, a listening quiet, the kind of room that knew it was about to hear something that it needed to hear and was prepared, for once, to simply hear it. Veloreth was at the central podium. He had prepared a speech about collective achievement and the power of partnership. It was a well-written speech. He had spent time on it. He put it down when Murray sat at the human delegation table, and he thought about the 3 pages she had sent him, and about the word that Ismara had meant when she used it, and about the weight of certain moments. He gave a shorter speech than the one he had prepared. He said the Council owed humanity a debt it could not fully pay. He said the formal record had been updated as agreed. He said he hoped the new accord would not be the last conversation between the Council and human space, but the first of many in which both sides arrived as equals. After the session in the corridor outside, Woojen stood beside Murray in his borrowed clean uniform, watching the alien delegates move past. He watched the crystalline ones and the gaseous ones and the bioluminescent ones, all of them different and all of them still here, which was the point. "Do you think they actually understand us now?" he asked. Murray thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "No," she said, "but they understand that they need to." She looked at the corridor, at the delegates, at the pale silver walls of a chamber that had once watched humanity walk away and had felt satisfied about it. "That's enough for now," she said. She meant it, not as a consolation, not as a limit, as a beginning which was the only direction that had ever been worth facing. Outside, the stars were where they had always been. Humanity was where it had always been too. Right in the middle of everything.